Good morning to you. This is Sky News Breakfast. It is 7 o'clock in the UK, 9 o'clock here in Kyiv as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters a fifth day. The next 24 hours is a crucial period. Ukraine's president updates Boris Johnson as a night of shelling is reported in the north. The human face of tragedy, 7-year-old Polina and her parents among more than 200 civilians reportedly killed in this conflict. Dangerous and unacceptable, the US and NATO condemn Vladimir Putin's order to put his nuclear forces on high alert. The UK fast-tracks laws to stop Russian oligarchs hiding dirty money in Britain as the EU shuts its airspace to Russian planes and funds arms supplies to Ukraine. Escaping Ukraine, almost 400,000 people have now fled the conflict so far as the EU opens its borders. Boris Johnson eases UK visa restrictions for Ukrainian refugees, but stops short of waiving all rules for all citizens seeking sanctuary. And the ruble is in big trouble this morning. Russia's currency falls to an all-time low as the West shuns Moscow. We'll have the latest throughout the morning from here in Kyiv and across Ukraine as Russian forces advance on the capital. Good morning from Kyiv. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has told Boris Johnson the next 24 hours will be crucial for his country. His comments come as satellite images emerge showing a 3-mile military convoy of Russian forces heading towards Kyiv. Blasts have been heard here in the capital in the early hours of this morning and also in the second city of Kyiv over in the east. These are the latest developments on day 5 of this conflict. Talks are due to take place between Ukrainian and Russian delegations later today over on the border between Belarus and Ukraine. The US has described President Putin's decision to put Russia's forces on high alert as an unprovoked escalation and totally unacceptable. The EU has opened its borders to Ukrainian refugees and is taking the unprecedented step of sending arms to Ukraine. US President Joe Biden says he'll host a call with allies and partners this afternoon to coordinate a united response. First, our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn has this report from Moscow.
Dawn over Kyiv after a quieter night. They had prepared all weekend, cleaning weapons, mustering for deployment. But the onslaught still hasn't come.
If Putin doesn't care about his citizens, the more reasons why he can spare strangers. People for him are only garbage, both his people and strangers.
Former boxing champion and Kiev mayor Vitaly Klitschko has this message for the invaders.
Go back home. You have nothing to find here. We hope the Russians take the decision, move back to Russia. They nothing to find here in our home.
The Russian advance may have stalled. Its troops and its armour not moving at the pace that had been feared, with reports it's disorganised and in places in disarray. Though not here, Stanitsia Luhanska is Ukraine, says the banner. But Russian troops have taken the town in eastern Ukraine, its soldiers taking up positions outside banks and other key buildings. This footage shows the impact of a Russian cruise missile strike on an airport in northwest Ukraine, allegedly launched from Belarus. And here from another angle. But on the border with Belarus, Russian and Ukrainian diplomats are due to meet later. Russian leader Vladimir Putin may yesterday have put his nuclear deterrence forces on raised alert. But he's also, it seems, giving diplomacy a chance before the fighting might resume in earnest. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said Britain will do all it can to get more arms to the Ukrainian military. I'm joined now from Westminster by the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. Good morning, Mr. Wallace. Good to talk to you again from here in Kyiv. First of all, Have we raised our nuclear deterrence alert in response to what President Putin has done?
Well, look, Mark, the language that President Putin has used doesn't actually link to anything off a Russian readiness procedure. It's really, we assess him putting the deterrent into the communication space, reminding people that he has a deterrent, and it's also about distracting the world and the public from what he's actually doing in Ukraine. It doesn't link to anything specific in their readiness structures of their forces. So he's made this comment. We keep it under review, but of course, NATO has a nuclear deterrent. The United Kingdom is NATO's nuclear deterrent, but obviously we're joined by France and the United States, and we keep our readiness very high. That's why we have a continued at-sea deterrent. But, what we shouldn't really forget that this is a big attempt to distract away from his troubles in Ukraine by just deploying into the sort of media space these phrases.
Right, but have you, just to be clear, have you responded to what he's done in any way in terms of our nuclear
I would never
readiness?
comment on our nuclear deterrence posture for operational and security reasons.
Do you think he's crazy enough to instigate a nuclear conflict?
No, I think he has certainly done a lot of irrational things recently. Obviously, first and foremost, the invasion of Ukraine against all the advice, all the international lobbying. I think I'm not going to speculate on what he would or wouldn't do, but that's why we all keep our deterrence at a state of readiness in the West to make sure that we can deter.
But do you think a cornered President Putin would be a dangerous man?
I think he's a dangerous man now.
I mean, if things got so desperate, would you think he could deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine?
But Mark, I'm not going to head down a road of speculation of what-ifs with President Putin. What we know is that President Putin is currently actually focused in the invasion of a sovereign country in Ukraine. He is a man that has shown himself to resort to all sorts of things, not least nerve agent on the streets of Britain. But I think he is focused with this, and I'm not going to go into speculations about nuclear weapon systems or anything else. I think that's just not only unhelpful, it's unnecessarily alarmist when actually his focus, his forces, his military leadership are focused on taking Ukraine.
Fair enough. What do you think is the latest intelligence? What do you see as the latest intelligence on how the Russians are doing and when you think Kyiv could fall?
I think your report is pretty accurate. We've just published our daily tweet at the start, or the first tweet of the morning, which gives us our assessed defence intelligence view of where we are. The main bulk of those armoured columns that you've been talking about are approximately 20 kilometres north of Kyiv, northwest of Kyiv. Some of the sporadic fighting is those sort of stay behind or indeed advanced forces that I think you've covered on other days, still around but not having the strategic impact that I think Russia had hoped. That airport, that strategic airport that you covered, I think, on the first day, that has changed hands a few times, clearly didn't get captured by the Russians in the way that they'd like to have used it, and it's forced them to do all sorts of things. The Russians have not captured the big cities like Cherniv and Kharkov up on the side, up in the northeast of the country, quite close to some of their borders, but they have made better progress than their other forces, still behind schedule in the south. So they're not on schedule. They are in some significant areas of disarray. Their logistics lines are therefore slowed down, and that's because they've based all of this on this sort of bizarre assumption that the Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators. Well, President Putin has taken that assumption, and now that is not the case. That's causing them to pause. It's causing them to have logistical trouble. And, of course, you've seen at first hand the strong bravery of the Ukrainians and their determination to defend their country. And I visited that country, Mark, 5 times, 3 times security minister, 3 times as defense minister, and twice as security minister. And if anyone wants to know the dividing line between Ukrainians and Russia, it is that interview you've just carried with an elderly gentleman who has signed up about the views of people in his country. In Ukraine, they recognize that individuals matter, their rights matter, And the Ukrainians' view of Russians are they don't count in the Russian game. It's simply just the powerful people in Russia that matter.
What would you say to Belarus? There are reports today that they are about to send thousands of troops into Ukraine to help the Russians. What would you say to them?
Well, I think, Belarus has a lot more to lose by being closer to Russia than it has to gain. It is a very poor country anyhow. The president pretty much ran off, scuttled really, to Kremlin when he had his rising recently, and has sold his soul for that reason. And now you have a vassal state potentially on the border. It won't help the Belarusians. It won't help the Belarusian armed forces. They're far less equipped than the Russians. They are not as good. They're not as well trained. And, if I was a Belarusian soldier, you should think that President Putin will be the first to put you in the front line because you are absolutely easy to sacrifice compared to Russian soldiers that he will think might have a political impact on him at home.
And on weapons and supplying weapons to Ukraine, have you managed to get any weapons into this country since the invasion began?
Yes, we've got lethal and non-lethal aid into Ukraine. I can't speculate where or how. I think that would put people at risk. The other thing I've done, Mark, which is, Britain was the first European country to step up to join America with lethal aid. I hosted last Friday a donor conference in Europe. We've now even got the Belgians and other countries who historically would have been hesitant delivering lethal aid. I welcome strongly the EU's position. It took quite a lot of effort.
But since the invasion began, sorry to interrupt you. Since the invasion began,
Yes,
have you managed to get
we have.
weapons into Ukraine?
Yes.
Isn't the truth that it's all a bit late? You've known that there's a threat to Ukraine, certainly since 2014. Shouldn't we have been arming the Ukrainians for years in just, because of a possibility of something like this happening?
Well, first of all, the United States have been arming them since 2015, 2014. They were the first to do lethal aid straight after Crimea. We complemented that at first by training 20,000 Ukrainians, and also only, I think it was last year, or if not 18 months ago, we signed a contract with Ukrainians to supply them with fast attack boats with missiles on them. So Britain was at the forefront. We were also then the first European country to do it. But should overall the West, after 2014, or maybe even after 2008 in Georgia, been more proactive in delivering a stronger resilience package to a number of states? I think obviously, we can see now that, that should have been the case across Europe, but Britain has not been in that position. Britain has been in the lead of it. I have links with my defence counterparts because I have visited so many times. I engage with them. We give them military support, and we'll continue to do that. But I also think, you have to also recognise when you're up against President Putin, that his irrational behaviour, which it seems to be getting greater, means it is definitely harder to predict what was happening. I was there in November. I was there, earlier, and even when he massed forces last April on his border, there were a significant number of European countries who refused to believe that he had any intention apart from intimidation. Yeah. Now, I think, the West, many countries in Europe will now be regretting those positions, but fundamentally Britain has been in the lead alongside the United States in helping those Ukrainians. And that's why we got to do the donor conference on Friday and brought 20, 30 countries around the table to deliver lethal and non-lethal aid. And now we're at the heart of the coordination of all those countries getting it into the country.
OK, I just want to get a couple more in. Would you support British volunteers coming over here to fight, as Liz Truss is suggesting?
Well, I think Liz Truss is right to say it is definitely, for all of us, a just cause, that this is about a sovereign democratic country being threatened or actually now invaded by a Russian state. And that is something that we should all stand up against, whether that's at home. I think what I'd say is we can all do our bit, whether that's donating through the Ukrainian embassy. I'd also say that, our armed forces are contributing in a proper way to doing this. If you're keen to help and you're a United Kingdom citizen, come and join our armed forces. There are lots of ways to help. Look, there are people who will go.
Better than volunteering to come and fight?
Well, I think what I would say is, unless you are properly trained, unless you are a experienced member of an armed forces, I think there are better ways for you to contribute to the security of Ukraine. The travel advice of the Foreign Office is not to go to Ukraine. You'll put yourself in harm's way. If people are determined to do that, my advice to them is there are many ways to help Ukraine, and unless you are a trained military personnel from a former career, as in you're not coming from our armed forces because you've got a job to do here, then I would advise you to explore with the Ukrainian embassy ways to do that.
OK, 2 more quick questions. Are we going to reverse the decision to cut 10,000 troops from our military?
Well, obviously, Mark, you wouldn't have noticed because you're focused on other things, but a few weeks ago I announced that the original baseline of 72,500 has gone up to another 500 to 73,000. And I've always said, as the threat changes, we must consider changing. The current strength of the army is 78,000. But what I have to say is something to really recognise from what the conflict we're seeing on our television screens is. I am not getting messages from the Ukrainians every day asking for tanks. I'm not getting them asking for armoured vehicles. I'm getting messages every day from the Ukrainians asking for anti-tank weapons, personnel being able to be carried by individuals. Yeah. I'm getting messages every day about anti-air missiles that can be carried by individuals. That's the type of warfare that is currently threatening the might of the Russian.
But we're entering an era, quite possibly, of confrontation with Russia, and you are effectively, let's be honest, cutting the army. Are you going to reverse? Are you going to speak to the Chancellor to get some money to reverse the cuts to the army?
Right. So, Mark, there's no cuts other than personnel. There's an increases to the army's capabilities. The army it's not just about people. Otherwise, you end up with the First World War where you have millions of people, but you don't have any tanks. The key here is to get that balance. So in the Defence Command Paper, we said a number of things should happen. One is spend the money on the armed forces, the people we have, to be better equipped, more lethal, more joined up, and at more readiness. Otherwise, you end up in an army I was in where we had on paper lots of divisions, but when you press the button, they were completely hollow because we ran out of money or we didn't have quite the kit to deliver it. So, and the other thing your viewers should understand, and I know they do, that, contrary to what a lot of commentators said, we got an extra £24 billion. We got the biggest settlement increase since the Cold War at the Defence Command Paper. That's not a cut in anybody's book. Yeah. We have changed to some extent the balance.
It's a cut in numbers of troops. It's a cut in numbers of troops. And I just want to finally...
Mark, could you acknowledge it's an increase in the defence budget? That would be useful if you could acknowledge it's an increase in defence budget. It's a massive increase. It's a massive increase in the equipment.
I was just talking about troops.
OK. So what we've seen in Ukraine...
Let me just ask you this.
Okay.
Let me just ask you this, because we've run out of time, I think. On visas, shouldn't we be doing what the EU is doing and allowing all Ukrainian refugees in?
Well, first of all, what was announced, or will be announced later today, is a first step. We're absolutely looking at all the different range of options we can apply to welcome Ukrainians in need. The first step is to make sure that Ukrainians who have family here, either settled or are dual nationals, that they can come and join them. But the second step we will look at about what we do with the refugee flows across the board. It's going to be a problem right across Europe, and we've obviously seen the European position change, I think, as of yesterday, and we will reflect on that and make decisions in the near future.
So you may do what the EU is doing, in fact.
I think what we'll do is, just like the size of the army, Mark, we'll keep it under review, dependent on how situations changes on the ground. I think that's perfectly legitimate. Remember, Britain's been incredibly generous with the Afghan scheme and the ARAP, which I was dealing with during Op Pitting. We've been one of the most generous countries when it came to, obviously, the Hong Kong nationals. So we have a track record of being generous in this area. We'll make sure it's done properly, and we'll obviously keep it under review as the facts on the ground change.
OK, we'll let you go. Good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Right, well, the latest satellite pictures released show a Russian convoy, a very long one, heading in this direction. These pictures from the private US company Maxar show a convoy near Kyiv. Now, that's a town around 40 miles north of here, and they show a deployment of hundreds, you can see them there, military vehicles, reportedly containing, well, fuel, logistics vehicles and self-propelled artillery. And that is a very long convoy indeed. Our correspondent John Sparks joins me now from Dnipro. Now that's in southeast of Ukraine, over in eastern Ukraine. John, just bring us up to date with what is happening in that area and in Kharkiv, where you were. There seems to be all sorts of, well, a very intense fight going on over that city.
Yeah, good morning, Mark. Yeah, here in Dnipro, it's been pretty quiet overnight. That hasn't stopped the air raid sirens from sounding about 4 times in the last 12 to 16 hours. We know the drill now at our hotel. We grab our helmets, our body armor, we troop down to the car park in the basement. We wait there for the all clear, and then we tramp back up again. But pretty quiet here overnight. There have been explosions and blasts heard where you are in Kyiv, also in Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, where there was fierce fighting yesterday. Several armored Russian columns tried to gain access to the city. The governor there says those attacks have been repulsed, but he has put into effect a 3 p.m. curfew today because of his fear, their fear, of Russian sabotage groups operating in the city. There have been missile strikes in Ukraine overnight as well, including in a city called Chernihiv. That's about a 3-hour drive north of where you are, Mark. The missile has hit a residential building. The lower 2 floors are on fire. An unknown number of casualties, we understand that from the Ukrainian government's communication department. But I think it's clear to say over the last 24 hours, the military situation for the Russians is not panning out in the way perhaps they anticipated. This conflict is having a galvanizing effect on the European Union in particular. I think it was interesting to hear Ben Wallace say the Ukrainians are asking him for shoulder-borne weapons. Well, you know, the Germans, before the conflict began, were talking about sending helmets, 5,000 helmets to the Ukrainian military. Now they're sending those missiles, 500 Stinger missiles, 1,000 anti-tank missiles. And the EU High Representative, like the Foreign Minister for the EU, he is now in talks with the Ukrainians to send them fighter jets, Russian-made fighter jets that Ukrainian pilots can use. That is a pretty extraordinary response to this conflict.
Yeah, it is an extraordinary response. John, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Moscow now. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, is there. And Dominic, first of all, I mean, the markets, we've been watching the ruble this morning. What is it, 30% down? And I don't know about the share markets, stock markets. What's happening?
Yeah, I think the ruble's pulled back a bit from the all-time low of 30% against the dollar, dropping by 30%, that is, to about 26%. So really tanking. And the central bank is going to be announcing more measures later on, but it's already doubled interest rates, raising them from 9.5% to 20%, and also selling companies, so private companies and state companies, to sell off their foreign reserves. The bind the Russians are in is that the ruble is tanking, and normally in that situation, you would take measures selling off gold, selling off your foreign reserves to try and shore up your currency. The problem with this is that in addition to these SWIFT sanctions that are being posed, cutting Russia out of the SWIFT global transaction system, these sanctions also effectively block the Russian central bank and state banks from access to those gold reserves or foreign reserves outside of Russia. So they don't have the kind of levers they would normally be pulling to try and shore the ruble back up. So they are in a difficult situation. They've taken some measures already, and they have effectively suspended trading in some markets, and we're expecting to see more measures announced later on today. I think that the question with all these sanctions, of course, is who is this going to hurt the most? And is this going to help Putin, or is it going to hinder him? We spoke to opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza yesterday, who was pretty vocal in his calls for Britain to do more to target the elites in Londongrad, as he called it in particular, and the West as well. And he said it's absolutely vital that these sanctions do target the elites surrounding Putin and don't hurt the ordinary people. And of course, if you're an ordinary Russian waking up today and you see the value of your currency tanking against external and foreign currencies, it's going to be a huge cause of concern. And it's possibly going to lead to panic. Not necessarily today, but in the days ahead, we could see a run on the banks. And that is obviously going to hurt ordinary Russians. And I think the other thing we need to think about, Mark, in this is playing into Putin's narrative. Putin's narrative is that the West is out to get Russia, but in particular, out to get him. He seems to believe that the West is hell-bent on regime change and is out to get him. That may seem rather perverse if you're outside of Russia, because you look at all of this and it looks like Russia has started this. But it seems to be, certainly in the rhetoric of the Russian leadership, this is a preemptive move, what it's doing against Ukraine, in the sense they say they have no alternative. Now, if Putin believes that, we simply don't really know what is going on inside his mind. But he's surrounded by securocrats who are telling him this the whole time, generals, commanders and defence ministers who are telling him that the outside world is out to get him. This obviously plays into that narrative. It helps him sell that narrative to the people, but also I think persuades him that the West is out to get him, and therefore he may be entrenching his position, and this may not be deterring him, as is the intention of those imposing the sanctions.
OK, Dominic, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, European nations and Canada have moved to shut their airspace to Russian aircraft. The Russian airline Aeroflot has been forced to cancel all flights to European destinations. Jets have been redirected mid-flight after the EU implemented a Russian flight ban. And the no-fly zone spans the entire 27-country bloc and prevents any and all Russian-owned aircraft from entering the Union's airspace or landing at their airports. Well, Air France is halting all flights to and from Russia. The company said the decision will also lead to routes that fly over Russia being stopped, such as flights to China and Japan. Alternative routes are being looked at. The airline Finnair says it will cancel flights to Russia, Japan, South Korea and China this week after suspending flights that fly over Russian airspace. Flights to Singapore, Thailand and India will continue, but with an added hour of flight time. Well, the UK government is set to introduce new legislation to crack down on dirty money in Parliament, not dirty money in Parliament, but dirty money in London through Russians. It's going to happen in Parliament. Under the proposals, the new laws will introduce a register of overseas entities to crack down on foreign criminals using UK property to launder money. Unexplained wealth orders will be reformed to target more corrupt elites. The Treasury's ability to take action against sanctions breaches will be strengthened. A reform of Companies House will also be published today, designed to clamp down on money laundering and fraud. England and Wales will not play against Russia in any international football fixture for the foreseeable future. Their decision adds to a growing list of measures sporting bodies are taking as they make a stand against the invasion of Ukraine. And Sky's Shaman Freeman-Powell is in the newsroom, and it does seem as if sport is taking a firmer stand against Putin.
It does, yes. The FA joins a long list of sporting bodies which are using whatever they can, whatever powers they have at their disposal to send a strong message to Russia and to stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Now, I have a statement from the FA which was released over the weekend. It says that out of solidarity with the Ukraine and to wholeheartedly condemn the atrocities being committed by the Russian leadership, the FA can confirm that we won't play against Russia in any international fixtures for the foreseeable future. It said this includes any potential match at any level of senior, age group or para football. And it follows associations of Poland, Sweden and the Czech Republic, who also said that they too will not play against Russia for the foreseeable future. Some had hoped, though, that FIFA would expel Russia from the World Cup. FIFA have spoken and made an announcement, but they didn't go that far. Instead, they said that Russia will be able to play at the World Cup, but just not under their name name or in their country. Instead, they will have to play under the name of the Football Union of Russia for competitions, and they will not be able to play in Russia. Instead, any matches that should have been played at home will have to be played in a neutral country. As well as this, spectators will not be allowed at stadiums, flags will not be flown, and the national anthem will not be allowed to be sung either. But some do not think that this goes far enough. Now, the president of the Polish FA said that it was totally unacceptable and had hoped that Russia would be expelled from the competition. However, FIFA said that this is still an option and that they wanted to see what happened, and that if the situation didn't improve rapidly, they would be considering this as well. So this is just the latest announcement from the latest sporting association.
OK, Shaman, thank you very much. Well, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the government will ease visa rules to make it easier for Ukrainians already settled in the UK to bring their immediate families over. But opposition parties say Britain should follow the EU and open borders to all Ukrainian refugees who need sanctuary. Sadia Chowdhury has this report.
Standing in solidarity with Ukraine, with other countries throwing open their doors for refugees of a war-torn nation, many feel that the UK isn't doing enough.
My deep apologies of the position of my Prime Minister, because he is not joining the sanctions.
As pressure builds, the government is to change visa rules to make it easier for Ukrainians who are settled in the UK to bring their families to safety.
Certainly we want people who have relatives in Ukraine to be able to bring them over as fast as possible. We want to make sure that we have routes for people fleeing disaster, war, persecution in Ukraine to come here. We'll also be partnering up with some of the countries in the immediate vicinity of Ukraine to help bring people over. Don't forget, the UK, since 2015, has been one of the most generous, if not the most welcoming country in Europe.
It could offer hope to Markian, a bricklayer whose 11-year-old daughter lives in Ukraine.
They are scared by, they said, we're just waiting. Maybe tomorrow would be better. Maybe tomorrow stop everything. We don't want to go anywhere. We want to stay at home. And this makes me more scary and nervous.
They've been meeting up on video calls.
Сьогодні був на протесті тут в центрі Лондона. Sometimes I just talking very strange for everyone. I said, just go. I said, what you can do, you just, children and women, what we can do there?
Labour has described the government's failure to offer a more wide-ranging visa waiver as shameful. Other European countries have announced an open-door policy for Ukrainians seeking sanctuary.
World, support Ukraine!
But not everyone wants to leave. One person told us her 68-year-old father was willing to take his hunting rifle to defend his country. Sadia Chowdhury, Sky News, in London.
And don't forget, every day this week we'll have a special programme twice a day on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We'll bring you the latest news from across this country, as well as our correspondents in Washington, Westminster and around Europe. That is Ukraine invasion at 1 p.m. and 7 p.m. All this week. Well, the UK is fast tracking plans to tackle dirty money. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has also pledged to get more arms to Ukraine's military, but the government has been criticised for not dropping visa rules for Ukrainians. Our political correspondent Tamara Cohen is in Westminster for us this morning. Good morning, Tamara. And Ben Wallace, I was interesting. I mean, he had a lot to say, didn't he, about what was going on here, but this question of visas suggesting there may be some more movement there.
I suspect there will be some more movement on it, Mark. The Home Office are looking at it at the moment. What Boris Johnson said last night, you may have seen pictures of him going to a Ukrainian church in London and being applauded by the people there as he lit a candle. He has announced that the visa rules will be relaxed. So if a Ukrainian is living in the UK already, they will be able to bring over their immediate family, that is a spouse, children, parents, if that person is under 18, without having to go through the complex and expensive visa rules. So the process will be much quicker for people who are in desperate situations. But what Labour are saying is this is still too restrictive, that the government should allow much more family members, elderly parents, for example, to come over to the UK, and that this is still the process the government had in place already. They've just speeded it up a bit and contrasted that unfavourably with what the EU are doing, which is essentially welcoming all Ukrainian refugees for a period of 3 years. So I suspect the Home Office will have to look at that again in the coming days. The Refugee Council also saying that it looks a bit mean-spirited. So the government will be looking at that. They are also announcing some much stricter sanctions in the next couple of days, including efforts, the Home Office say, to unmask the owners of big, expensive houses in the UK that are suspected to have been bought with dirty money, because the UK has always allowed people to buy properties through companies anonymously and not give their name or the source of that money. That's going to be clamped down on in the coming months. And we've also heard today that the UK is taking measures against Russia's central bank, the Chancellor says, to try and cut Russia off from international finance.
OK, Tamara, thank you very much indeed. Well, many people here in Kyiv have been waking up in bomb shelters where they've sought safety from shelling as Russian forces advance on the capital city here. Well, Alexei Goncharenko is a member of Ukraine's parliament, and he joins me now from Kyiv. And very good to talk to you, Alexei. Thanks for being with us. And Ukrainian forces seem to be putting up quite a fight.
Not quite a fight. I can say Ukrainian forces are winning. That's the reality. The plan, Putin's plan was to take Kyiv in 2 days. Then he gave them 2 more days. And I can tell you, he can give them 200 more days or 2,000 more days. We will not surrender. Like you told, I heard about a 68-year-old man who said, I will take my hunting rifle, and we will fight. And that's about tens of thousands of people in Ukraine. Me being not absolutely military person, that's what I'm sitting with. And I'm in the headquarters of one of the territorial defense battalions, and we have a number of MPs there. And we're just waiting. If the enemy will enter the city and move to the center, we will go and fight and defend the parliament. So that is Ukrainian parliamentarism, not to vote, but to fight with an automatic rifle.
Yeah, and Alexei, how long do you think you can hold out for?
I'm sure that we will hold on. The time is not here. I mean, we will hold on till the moment we will win. That's the whole story. And when it will be, it depends not only from us and from our armed forces, but certainly of Western countries and free world. And we are waiting for more sanctions against Russian Federation. The first steps are good, but we need to go further. Even kickoff from SWIFT is partial. Only a targeted list of Russian banks are kicked off, and others are not. So these allow Putin's regime to find the ways out from the sanctions. Also, we believe in the ban, embargo on Russian oil and gas, because it's a bloody oil, bloody gas. It's full of Ukrainian blood now, including Ukrainian children. And certainly non-fly zone. I just want to address thank you very much, through your media, UK politicians to help us in this, because non-flight zone is something very important, even first of all, from humanitarian point of view, because you know that Russians are using aircrafts and missiles to attack residential areas, hospitals, kindergartens, and that is awful. And people in Kyiv now, you know, that like in London in 1940, are sitting in metro stations for hours each day. So that's something that should be stopped. And NATO can help us in this, just closing our skies. We're not asking for boots on the ground. We are ready to fight for ourselves. But in the skies, we really need help.
I mean, the danger is, or the fear is, that NATO trying to enforce a no-fly zone could lead to a much broader war.
I can tell you that the fear should be that if Putin would not be stopped here, there will be much broader war. He will go forward. He will go further. He will go to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Georgia. It's a Hitler. He will never stop. No Munich, because Munich 1938. That's he is looking for. But I already see that that will not happen. We need D-Day. We need landing in Normandy. We need something like this to stop a bigger war. And don't forget that there are other dictatorships throughout the planet, which now are very much looking at Putin and thinking, what will be his destiny? And if he would be successful, I'm sure he would not because of our resistance. But if he would be successful, they will also attack their neighbors, those whom they don't like. So it will be a disaster. So free world should now show the strength.
It seems that, as you say, President Putin miscalculated on many fronts. He miscalculated the resistance, underestimated the resistance of the Ukrainian forces and the Ukrainian people. He seems to have miscalculated on sanctions. He probably didn't think he was going to get hit quite as hard as he has. But do you think a cornered President Putin, a President Putin whose options are running out, becomes a dangerous President Putin, a more dangerous President Putin?
Let us not say that, let us not corner Putin, because why Putin is cornered? Let him take his forces out from Ukraine. Ukraine is not saying, give us Moscow. We not have any intentions on Russian territory. Just to take off from our territory. That's all we want. So he is cornering himself. Not somebody is cornering him. And quicker he will understand this, better it will be.
And just finally, and very briefly, do you have any hope at all that something may result from the talks that are going on between Ukraine and Russia today?
Speaking with Russia, you need to have an automatic rifle in your hands. And because we have now, I think there is some chance. If not today, maybe the next days, with the strong position of the free world, they need to go to the peace talks. I believe in this.
Okay, Alexei, look, thank you very much. And
thank you.
I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you. Thank you. Right, well, Germany is set to sharply increase its spending on defence in the wake of the invasion here. I'm joined now from Berlin by Thomas Kleiner-Brockhoff, the Vice President of the foreign policy think tank, the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He was also advisor to the former President of Germany, Joachim Gauck. Thank you very much for being with us. And it's interesting, isn't it? Germany was perceived as the weakest link in all this in terms of supplying weapons, in terms of sanctions. And things have turned out very differently.
Oh, sure they have. It was a memorable day yesterday in Parliament, and not many people, including myself, expected it just to play out as dramatically as it did. The Olaf Scholz government that was perceived as hesitant, by some even as weak, and as not having heard the shot, broke free and got ahead of the curve and enacted and announced the biggest foreign policy change in my lifetime. It was a stunning moment in Parliament yesterday.
And these are historic changes brought about by President Putin's invasion of an independent democratic country.
Mr. Putin plays a huge part in this. The foreign policy community had for a long time tried to push successive German governments to open their eyes to a changing international environment, to one in which Germany's posture was no longer equivalent and appropriate to, but hadn't been heard. And so yesterday was the day when Germany, the country as a whole, and you could physically feel it in Parliament, decided to want to stand up to Putin. I think the nuclear threats played their part, but also the fact that Olaf Scholz took the trip to Moscow and heard it from the horse's mouth probably played a part in his calculus. And what happened here was not just a dramatic increase in defense spending. It was a complete turnaround of the posture of German foreign policy, which will now no longer want to accommodate and somehow try to get along, even with the dictator, on the assumption that there is no security in Europe without, or certainly not against, Russia, to a posture of now isolating Russia, being independent and not interdependent with Russia in terms of energy, and certainly then there is a defense factor.
Yeah, well, it is hugely significant, and that was to be my final question to you. Germany is a lot more reliant on, well, currently on Russian energy than many other European countries. How badly do you think, Russia will hit back at Germany?
That's exactly the right question. We can't possibly know that at this stage. Will they retaliate by reducing gas flows? And that will be the answer to that question, because clearly it is a highly risky move, which they have prepared by trying to buy gas on the spot market, by rerouting ships. But all the measures that they want to take will take time to kick in, building LNG ports, building national reserves. All of that will take time. So the risk is clearly in the short term and be very much dependent on how Mr. Putin reacts. In the mid and long term, the acceleration of renewable energy, which the finance minister, Mr. Lindner, called freedom energy, is going to be the key. But until then, many compromises will have to be made, including the question whether the last remaining nuclear power plants, which would be effective in base load, will need to be kept online. Yeah. A tough question for the Greens, which is still ahead.
Yeah, all decisions to be made. Thomas, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
The invasion is taking a heavy toll on the people here, of course. The Health Ministry has reported that more than 350 people have been killed, while the UN says around 370,000 people have now fled the country. Dmytro Sherengovsky is vice-rector at the Ukrainian Catholic University and joins me now from Lviv, which is over in western Ukraine. Thank you very much for being with us. First of all, how are things there? Are the Russians targeting the city where you are, Lviv?
Thank you for having me. So not currently the situation pretty stable, but every morning we have a few alarms, and we have few alarms per day. So they are targeting not only the military infrastructure, but also civil infrastructure. So we can't be sure.
And the university, I gather, is helping people who are moving west, who are moving away from the main fighting. A humanitarian crisis is clearly unfolding. How are you being able to help?
So we turned our institution into the spot for gathering the humanitarian help from the citizens, from the neighbors, but also from NGOs. So all the community is helping, both faculty members and students. And every day we have thousands of help that is coming, and we are definitely supporting, giving that to both to army and also to IDPs who are coming to Western Ukraine, precisely Lviv. So Lviv take the strategy of being the primary place of location, and after that, the IDPs are going to the smaller towns or to the other cities. And as a university, we also hosted the families of our students from east and southern part of Ukraine and other IDPs that are coming to Lviv.
And Dmytro, are the numbers increasing all the time?
Yeah, indeed, that's true. So every day we are having more and more people. There are a few troubles with their getting here. So the railway stations are not working to the great extent correctly. So they are working, but still there are some limitations. And the roads are also difficult to come because of the great lines.
But you are not fearful for yourself. You're prepared to stay and to help these people who are fleeing cities in Ukraine.
So students are ready to do this. We are inspired by the possibilities, actually, that we can help our society and help our army. So a number of people, including myself, so we are registered in the civil territory defense. And after the day, we are patrolling and we are going through the streets and checking if everything is correct. So everybody is doing something like to secure the situation, to be sure that neither Russian invader nor other people are doing some harm to the city property and to the people.
And what do you make of this spirit of resistance that exists clearly where you are, and also clearly from what we've seen, you know, across Ukraine? What do you make of that?
So we are well prepared for that. And this is the chance of us to unite, definitely, and to resist. So the so-called Maidan spirit is here. Everybody is helping everyone with what we can do. And this is a great story of the decentralization of power, when in the cities, the civil society can take responsibility and also help our authorities to do their best.
And just briefly, in 20 seconds or so, you yourself and your other students are prepared to carry on doing this, whatever happens with this invasion?
Sure. This is our obligation. This is our country, and we're definitely doing that.
Okay, Dmytro, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So the situation here in the capital, Kyiv, is quiet at the moment, but the Russian forces are massing. We know of a long column, a 3.5-mile column of Russian infantry vehicles closing in on the capital. But this morning, as yet, it remains reasonably quiet on day 5 of this invasion.